Okay, start.
Fantastic. All right, everyone. Welcome to this latest in the Dublin Food Co-op Community Development Programme. I'm delighted to welcome you to this very kind of interesting and probably quite thought-provoking discussion on Doughnut Economics and the role that cooperatives might play in building an economy that fits within the donut. Just a little bit of housekeeping at the beginning. We're going to be recording this session, so anybody who doesn't want to be on the recording is just best not speaking. But other than that, you won't be on the recording. And I suppose finally, we've got quite a large number of people on today. So if everybody can just be mindful to keep their microphones on mute when they're not speaking, we'd be very grateful. So without further ado, I will hand over to Róisín from the Irish Doughnut Economics Network to introduce this session and to facilitate the rest of the session. Thanks, Róisín.
Thanks, and a big thanks to the Dublin Food Co-op for bringing Carol and myself together to have this conversation. I'm really excited to listen to Carol. So I'm just going to do a really short introduction of Irish Doughnut Economics Network and share some of the story with you. So just let me share my screen. Use the chat if you want to. Maybe let everybody know where you're dialing in from and say hi. And if you're dialing in from an organization, let us know in the chat as well so we can keep an eye. I'm a fan of knowing who's on the call and where you're dialing in from. And that's one of the things that I've been able to map the conversation on Irish Doughnut Economics. So you'll see this is our logo and it's the donut, and it's the Irish Doughnut Economics Network has been up in action since September 2020 and really came about because I started, in COVID, sitting in the garden, I started thinking about, well, how do we create a future worth living into? And I saw DEAL, the Irish, or the Doughnut Economics Action Lab happen, and got into action around that and have started to bring people together in Ireland around the discussion of Doughnut economics. None of us are experts. Actually, some of us are experts. I'm not an expert. I'm learning and actively learning, and really encourage people to use action and use curiosity to learn and to discover things and to be in action. So what is Doughnut economics? So Doughnut economics is this concept that looks about how to think like a 21st century economist. And it looks at the world in a different way, not in a separate way, but in a joined way. So the donut is basically two circles. The outer circle is the ecological foundation, and that's the space that we're living beyond the planetary boundaries in how we're living our lives in disconnected ways to nature. The internal circle is this strong social foundation that Kate Raworth talks about. And you can see in the middle of this slide, it covers things like health, food, water, energy, public voice, peace, justice, income, work, and education. So the space between those two circles is the safe and just space for humanity. There are people who fall through the center circle, and Doughnut economics is about making sure that we have a strong social foundation and that we are living within the planetary boundaries. And Irish Doughnut Economics Network is about exploring those ideas and how to bring them into action in a really active way, not just from a grassroots level, but also from a policy level, so that we can really shape what the future is and the future value of Ireland as a country is. So we're open, we're an active network, and we're spread all across the country and welcoming people as we go, people who are curious and also seeking different kinds of answers. So just to, this is Ireland, what it looks like in the donut. You can see on the left here, there's a reference. I'll share these slides afterwards. They can maybe be shared via the Dublin Food Co-op, and you can find the information. All of this information is on the DEAL website, which is the doughnut-economics.org website. And you can join that network and keep up to date on things that are happening. So this network was launched in September last year, and it's now got a global group that's active, up and running, and looking at not just city scale donuts, but actually bioregional donuts. So there you can see the IDEN story there. We've been in action hosting virtual cuppas And just the story is that I started hosting virtual cuppas as a way to talk to people and discover and learn about Irish, not just about the Irish context of Doughnut Economics, but to meet people who were also interested and also asking questions. So as my Friday for the Future action last year, between September and December, I held weekly virtual cuppas with the Irish Network, and we co-hosted them. And then there was a book club that formed because we all felt we needed more information on Doughnut Economics, and we had a collective reading that was also extended out internationally. And we had some amazing people come join that reading and learning together and share the context. We run a Slack channel and we have a wiki, which is the Irish DE Network. It's at the bottom of the screen. So this is pretty much the story. We have a global reach as well. So as an Irish person, I don't just think that Ireland is its own small context. I realize we have a far bigger reach and often punch above our weight, for want of a better term. So I've really held some of the conversations, the monthly conversation that's held the second Tuesday of every month, which today is our monthly open cuppa. We have one starting at 7 p.m. this evening, but I hold that as an open space. So if anybody globally wants to come and join that conversation, they are welcome in that monthly cuppa. In the Slack channel, we hold weekly Friday morning conversations still, but they're specifically for the network and how the network supports each other to be in action. We're delighted that we have a West Cork Doughnut. I don't know if anybody from West Cork Doughnut Economy Network is on the call. Maybe you'd say hi in the chat, that would be super. But they are in action, actively building their Doughnut, which is amazing. And there's talk about Doughnut's merging and coming together in Wexford, where I am, and in Wicklow and Dublin and Kerry. So do come and find us and join the cuppa. As I mentioned, the next one is tonight, and all are welcome, and you'll find the link that you can follow to book the event later on. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Carol Power from UCC, and she is going to talk to us about the context of Doughnut Economics and cooperatives, and then we're going to have a Q&A session afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I'm going to invite Carol to share her screen and welcome her to present to you. Thanks, Carol. Hopefully that's working.
Yes, thank you, Róisín. So hopefully you can see my screen there.
No, not yet, Carol.
Not yet, okay. Try again.
I still see Róisín's screen.
I'm trying to stop sharing my screen, but the joys of digital facilitation and events. So bear with us. You guys just talk in the chat for a minute, and while get the technology. Is it stop sharing?
It's sharing.
No, I can see Carol's PowerPoint.
Great.
Brilliant. Great,
thank you. So thanks, Róisín, for that introduction and for that overview of Doughnut Economics. So I suppose it's a concept that really has gained huge attention internationally, and as we can see here in Ireland as well, it has attracted attention from major world leaders and influencers. It's come up at the World Economics Forum. It's attracted the attention of high-profile figures like Pope Francis and Sir David Attenborough. And our own President, Michael D. Higgins, also, who cites it as an important part of that paradigm shift that's needed to link economy, society, and ecology. So just to say a little bit about my own work and how I have been exploring this idea of Doughnut Economics. So I'm a lecturer in the business school in UCC and a researcher with the Centre for Co-operative Studies, also based in UCC. And I teach on aspects of sustainable development and sustainable business to students on business courses, government and politics, and international development. And we have a master's program on co-ops, agri-food and sustainable development, and a master's program on cooperative and social enterprise as well, which is an online part-time program. And through these various courses, I have been introducing the idea of Doughnut Economics to students on these courses. And it's a really useful framework for examining and kind of, I suppose, devising a positive way forward in the context of the climate emergency, the biodiversity crisis, and the challenges of inequality that face our society globally. So just a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So I suppose there's a lot in Doughnut Economics. Róisín has given us a nice, concise introduction, so I don't propose to go into an awful lot of detail other than how it relates to cooperatives. So I'll just do a very brief overview and consider how the current economic system is failing us and what Doughnut Economics has to offer. And then we move on to look at how cooperatives fit with Doughnut Economics. So looking at the idea of co-ops as catalysts for Doughnut economic transformation. And also, if we have time at the end, we might look at how Doughnut Economics can perhaps introduce a new perspective for co-ops also. So this here is the donut of social and planetary boundaries. So Doughnut Economics was just very briefly developed by Kate Raworth, the British economist, and it was developed while she was working with Oxfam back around 2011, and she, I suppose, really develops that the whole Doughnut Economics approach in her book from 2017, focusing on Doughnut Economics as the way an economist should think in the 21st century. So I suppose in economics, and I'm not going to kind of focus on economic theory today, I'm not an economist, but I suppose anyone, if you think of the discipline of economics and you think of the type of diagrams that you see, you know, you see kind of things like GDP growth, where you're looking for a continuous upward trend to indicate progress. And that's hugely problematic. So Kate Raworth talks about our addiction to growth, where economic growth is really viewed as the goal rather than a means to an end. So we've essentially become obsessed with GDP as a measure of success. And Marjorie Kelly of the US Democracy Collaborative points out the contradiction of using GDP to measure progress. So it's a very one-dimensional economic view of progress. And she cites the example of, you know, if you have a major oil spill, given that GDP is the value of goods and services produced in an economy, then the economic activity involved in cleaning up that oil spill actually counts as a positive for GDP, even though it's a catastrophic event environmentally. So when Kate Raworth was kind of looking at these ideas and also the problems of, you know, the failure of economic growth to address inequality, she started to draw what progress might look like. And how we might achieve the goals of humanity in an environmentally safe way and an equitable way. And that's how she came up with the donut that Róisín described earlier. So from a social perspective and the desire to achieve greater equality, the neoliberal ideology argues that growth will even things up, that if the economy is allowed to grow, wealth will eventually trickle down to lower socioeconomic groups. And there may be some increase in inequality before this resolves itself, but this is seen as inevitable, it's an inevitable part of economic growth. But we know, of course, that economic growth does not address inequality. If you look at research by Oxfam, for instance, it shows that globally over 80% of the increase in wealth in 1 year went to the richest 1% of the global population, while the poorest half saw no increase at all. And so this is really kind of driven by this addiction to growth, and we don't get the results that are really we're meant to achieve through this growth. And so the real goal, Kate Raworth argues, is to provide for the needs of humanity. So to provide the 12 dimensions of that social foundation within planetary boundaries. And the emphasis should be on creating a thriving society rather than a growing economy. So the donut provides for everything we need, and that should allow everybody to participate equally in society. And if individuals or communities experience a shortfall in any of those dimensions of the social foundation, then they fall out of the donut, they fall out of the safe space. And the outer ring then is when we breach the ecological ceiling. And of course, we know that that desire to achieve continuous economic growth has put extreme pressure on that ecological ceiling, resulting in biodiversity loss, climate change, air pollution, and so on. So where do co-ops fit in the Doughnut Economics view of the world? So in her writing, Kate Raworth makes fairly limited explicit reference to co-ops. In her book, she does reference member co-ops and employee-owned enterprises as what she calls a long-established cornerstone of distributive enterprise design. But I suppose, much of what she says about co-ops, it's not explicit, but it's implied in the theory that she's developing. So most of what I'm going to say today really is based on my own inferences from Raworth's work and my personal reflections as to how co-ops fit with the Doughnut Economics approach. So for Raworth, the economy ought to be designed to be regenerative. So that's moving from the linear economy where we take the resources of the earth, make products, use them. We have a highly disposable culture. So we dispose of those products when we no longer have use for them. And the idea is that we move from from a linear economy to a circular economy that is regenerative. So we're looking at, repairing products, upcycling, recycling, reusing materials. And so there's obviously scope for co-ops to get involved in that circular economy and contribute towards a regenerative economy. Today I'm going to focus primarily on the distributive by design aspect of Doughnut Economics and that Raworth has developed. So conventional approaches to addressing inequality emphasize the eventual trickle down of wealth through the socioeconomic hierarchy. So the idea is that economic growth creates employment, and then we redistribute income through taxation and social welfare. And while redistribution is important, Raworth argues that we must go further and that the economy must in fact be designed to be distributive. So this means redistributing wealth and control over the resources that support wealth creation. Essentially creating more democratic ownership and control over the sources of wealth, such as land, money creation, ownership of enterprise, technology, and knowledge. And our economic system as it stands is really dominated by shareholder capitalism. And there are fundamental flaws in the design of shareholder capitalism. So decision-making in business corporations is controlled by a tiny group of people. And the US economist Richard Wolff has highlighted the statistic that in the United States, 1% of all shareholders own about 2/3 of the shares in companies. And of course, there are small shareholders also, but because voting rights are proportional to the number of shares held, so one vote for every share, this 1% of people control decision making. And not just in companies, because as it was Richard Wolff would say that the organization is kind of the unit by the corporation is the unit by which the economy is organized. So this top 1% have a huge influence over all of our lives. Shareholders vote for the board of directors, who ultimately decide what is produced, what technology is used, where it's produced, and what will be done with profits. So you have this tiny group of people making decisions while workers have to live with the consequences of these decisions. And Richard Wolff highlights the contrast between the values of representative democracy that we espouse and uphold in relation to political democracy, and the inherently undemocratic nature of capitalism. So, we tolerate in the economy and in capitalism a fundamentally undemocratic system that would not be tolerated in societies that uphold democracy in terms of political representation. So companies extract value from the labor that's deployed to create wealth. And this wealth accrues to those major shareholders, the 1% who own most of the shares. So designing an economy that's distributive seeks to create a more democratic economy that empowers people to have more agency and more control over their lives. So I'm conscious that there may be some people on the webinar today who know a lot about Doughnut Economics and maybe don't know so much about co-ops. I'm not going to go into detail about co-ops. I'll give a definition from the International Cooperative Alliance, which is essentially that is a co-op is an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. So if you look at that definition, and I suppose when I refer to co-ops, I'll be referring to them as, I suppose, the opposite to your typical kind of extractive type of enterprise, and that will help you to develop that understanding of cooperatives if you're not already familiar with them. But I suppose what may strike you there from the definition is that it's not, a co-op is not something that's set up to achieve profit for shareholders. The shareholders are actually the people who use the service of the co-op or who work in the co-op, the people who interact on a regular basis with the co-op. And that contrasts very much with shareholder capitalism, where these key decisions are really influenced by people that have no affinity or no loyalty to a particular place. They're motivated by profit, essentially. So Kate Raworth is influenced by the work of Marjorie Kelly. Kelly has worked significantly on alternative enterprise design. And Kelly argues that there are two design principles that are key to achieving an economy that distributes the value it creates. And those two design principles are rooted membership and stakeholder finance. And both of these really fit nicely with the cooperative model. I would say that before I go on, if you do want to know more about cooperatives and setting up cooperatives in Ireland, Dublin Food Co-op had an excellent webinar a few weeks ago delivered by Tiziana O'Hara from Cooperative Alternatives. So I would direct you to the recording of that webinar on the Dublin Food Co-op website if you'd like to find out more about that. So Marjorie Kelly outlines 5 key design traits by which we compare extractive enterprise and what she calls generative enterprise. Firstly, what is the primary purpose of the enterprise? Is it primarily to maximize returns for shareholders, or is it contributing to a bigger purpose? And so increasingly, we see large multinational corporations exploring their purpose beyond profit. And of course, for them, that doesn't mean abandoning the profit motive. It means identifying how the company can deploy its resources to solving social and environmental problems and creating what's called shared value. Co-ops, on the other hand, start with a purpose or a mission. So they're designed for use by their owners, whether the owners are the users of the service, the producers or the workers, or members of a community-owned co-op. And while they have to balance the books and they have to, be financially viable, they're not designed specifically to maximize profits or to achieve continuous economic growth. So they're really, co-ops are, I suppose, the ultimate purpose-driven organization. And as we see more and more conventional companies exploring that idea of purpose and using purpose to create shared value and to create additional profits. So there is an extractive dimension still. It's interesting to note how co-ops actually have a natural advantage there because they are set up, they're purpose-driven organizations set up with a particular purpose in mind. Secondly, how is the organization governed? Or more particularly, what are the values that shape how it's governed? So how are performance and success measured? How is the organization held to account? In an organization driven by profit and short-term returns, investment in longer-term transformation may suffer. Co-ops, on the other hand, are underpinned by the cooperative values and principles which prioritize people over profit, and this should drive their governance. And how the organization is governed also is, of course, linked to ownership, which I'll come to in a moment. The third design trait that Kelly looks at is network. So how is the organization networked? How does it relate to its stakeholders, its customers, its suppliers? So shareholder capitalism prioritizes the demands of shareholders to earn a profit, whereas stakeholder capitalism is more considerate of balancing shareholder interests with those of employees, customers, suppliers, and communities where they operate, and so on. So the democratic and inclusive nature of co-ops means that they're focused on balancing the needs of those different stakeholders. So for instance, they may have particular emphasis on ethical supply chains, for instance. And of course, the shareholders in the co-op are the owners of the co-op and the people who interact with the co-op and who use their services or work in the co-op. Fourthly, and very importantly, is the issue of ownership. So is ownership dominated by major shareholders who don't have ties or loyalty to place? Perhaps it's a family business with ties to the locality that's more embedded in the area, or perhaps it's owned in whole or in part by its workers. So companies owned by major shareholders who are in business purely to make a profit and have no allegiance to place or to their workforce will take decisions based on self-interest. So that might involve, pulling out of Ireland and relocating a manufacturing facility to China or so on. Key decisions are driven by lowering costs and maximizing profit. And if you contrast this with a co-op, so obviously, family businesses locally owned are kind of mirror the co-op side of the spectrum. But I suppose the co-op is, where workers or producers who create the value or the service users who own the co-ops actually make the decisions in the interests of their fellow members. And linking back to governance in co-ops, decisions in co-ops are made on the basis of one member, one vote, regardless of the equity invested in the co-op by individual members. So that, you know, contrasts hugely with shareholder capitalism, where you know, your number of votes is proportional to the number of shares that you own. And then ownership is, of course, tied up with the source of finance. So shareholder capitalism tends to prioritize short-term quarterly profits. And there are some examples of companies that have discontinued quarterly reporting to allow them to invest in longer-term purpose-driven transformation that attracts a different type of investor. While co-ops have to generate revenue sufficient to ensure their viability, profit itself is not the reason for the co-op's existence, and they have more freedom, therefore, to put purpose before profit, and to reinvest profits in the cooperative. And they've also been shown to be more resilient through economic crises, as co-ops are better able to withstand periods of low profit, so they don't have to answer to external shareholders. So in essence, capital is more patient and is not kind of seeking constant short-term profits. So according to Marjorie Kelly, in contrast to extractive capitalism, the generative economy is life-serving. It supports employee ownership and local ownership. It's about paying decent wages and allowing the people who generate the wealth to capture its value. And it provides for the needs of communities to be served in an equitable and sustainable way. So what Rayworth is proposing really in Doughnut Economics is complete systemic change. It asks us to turn accepted conventional economic wisdom on its head. And in a report advocating for the potential of co-ops in the UK, Lawrence and his co-authors tell us that co-ops are both catalysts for and symptoms of systemic change. They provide an organizational model to bring about change and create a more distributive and democratic enterprise sector. But they would also signal the emergence of a different type of economy, where thriving businesses are organized so they address deep democratic deficits generated by current patterns of ownership and operate with values of participation and community control while placing a primacy on social and ecological goals. So they are essentially distributive by design. So just to look very briefly at I suppose some examples of what co-ops in Ireland are already doing in relation to the social foundation of the Doughnut. So we have a long tradition in Ireland of co-ops providing that social foundation in certain sectors. But there's also significant potential for their development in a wider range of sectors. The most well-established in Ireland and the most widespread are the agri-co-ops and of course credit unions. Credit unions, in fact, were hugely important in promoting social equity when they started up in the late 1950s and 1960s. Because they gave ordinary people access to affordable credit under fair terms and conditions. They provided small loans for the type of people that, the mainstream banks just wouldn't entertain. We have lots of examples of, for instance, group water schemes organised as co-ops. And we see the seeds of new co-op sectors emerging now in Ireland in the areas of renewable energy, and housing. In relation to decent work and income, The gig economy is growing in Ireland as it is internationally, and high-profile international examples of companies that adopt a gig economy business model would include companies like Uber and Deliveroo. And while conditions may vary across the full range of these companies, and we've seen legal challenges to some of their business models and the status of employees and workers, in general, those who work in the gig economy lack security of income and social security, and usually have to, for instance, maintain, own their own and use their own cars and bikes, and maintain them, pay their own insurance, etc. So there's scope to develop platform co-ops to give these workers a fairer deal. Again, Dublin Food Co-op had a very interesting webinar recently on Co-op Cycle, an initiative that was developed in France as a way for delivery workers to organize themselves to give them more bargaining power, give them more protection and solidarity. We see similar examples, the Smart Co-op in Belgium, that gives freelancers in various sectors the benefits of solidarity, with the flexibility of working as individuals, so providing services like invoicing clients, organizing member social insurance and tax, etc. So there's lots of scope there for the development of platform co-ops. Finally, I would say in relation to the social foundation, there are some international examples and very good examples of community wealth building. So worker co-ops would be an important organizational form in the community wealth building strategy of Cleveland, Ohio in the US. So Cleveland is a city in America's Rust Belt that suffered the effects of deindustrialization, leading to high unemployment and deprivation. And in 2009, they started a community wealth building strategy. And the idea is to capture the value of goods and services that are procured by big spenders in a local economy. Public sector organizations are used as anchors for this strategy. So the objective is that you have major institutions that are well embedded in the area, such as hospitals, universities, etc., who are encouraged to increase their spend locally. Co-ops, in the Cleveland case, co-ops were developed to meet the needs of those organizations. So you have a laundry co-op, a sustainable energy solutions co-op, and a food growing co-op. Closer to home, we have the Preston model, which uses a combination of, it's a similar model, but it uses a combination of small to medium-sized enterprises, and also supports the development of worker co-ops, where there is a need identified to develop a particular service in an area. So there are just some examples of, I suppose, how co-ops can really work on strengthening that social foundation and providing those 12 dimensions that support the social foundation. So I'm conscious of time moving on. I'll just very briefly say that this diagram here shows the portrait. It's a template for a portrait of your co-op through 4 lenses. Now, this is based on the idea that Kate Rayworth puts forward, and it's developed by Doughnut Economics Action Lab in association with a number of other organizations. to enable cities, and you know, it's being developed to work down through the various territorial levels, to enable areas to create a self-portrait, to see, you know, what would it mean for people locally to thrive in a social sense. So what, you know, what are their visions and values, and what would enable people to thrive? Similarly, locally, you know, what could be done in terms of supporting local ecology. And then also, you know, looking at the global situation socially and locally, and how we, you know, given that we live in a globalized world, how do our local actions kind of impact on the world beyond our locality? So we could spend a little time on this, but I want to leave time for a more interactive conversation. So this is just, I've just adapted this template, so that if you're involved in a co-op, you could perhaps use this as a framework to look at your co-op through these different lenses. And if we have time, and if people are interested in talking further about that, we can do so in the discussion. The one caveat I would place on that is that, you know, we can all kind of look at ourselves through the donut, you know, from national to city level to community down to even the household. So I think it might be a useful tool for co-ops. But place-based coalitions are really important in implementing the donut. And in a sense, co-ops are already involved in the donut, but we wouldn't want them to kind of, I suppose, I wouldn't be suggesting that co-ops just take this and look at their own co-ops through the donut lens and kind of say that's the job done, because, you know, we want co-ops engaging with the wider community and discussing these issues. So just to close the presentation, I wanted to leave you with this quote from the ecological economist Herman Daly, who really has been, I suppose, advocating for this way of thinking since the 1970s and critiquing that addiction to growth. So growth is quantitative increase in physical scale, while development is qualitative improvement or unfolding of potentialities. So my concluding thought is that co-ops can provide a breeding ground for that potential to unfold and lead to improvement in people's lives by introducing more democracy into the economy and providing the forum through which people can be actively engaged in this process. So thank you, and I'll hand back to Róisín.
Before you do that, Carol, can I ask you to reshare the second last slide, because actually we could probably have talked for the whole hour about this slide. And I see that the Dublin Food Co-op Secretary, which is Sam, in case you don't know, is he's just put in the chat that we must organise a second webinar aimed specifically at those working within cooperatives and how they can use the Doughnut economic lens. So I think this is a really interesting slide. And it's always interesting to see how Doughnut economics is brought into people's realities and how they get to live into it. So if you could leave that slide up, I think that's really useful. If there's any questions, I'd love to see you put the questions in the chat to make sure that we capture all the questions, even what you're thinking about or what Carol's presentation and discussion has been on. Carol, thank you so much. It's the last piece for me was really interesting about how you brought us on that journey between, you know, what's the current practice in cooperatives and how are cooperatives alive in our society today? And obviously the Dublin Food Co-op is a really good example of a long-standing food, not just food, but cooperative in Ireland. when I lived in Dublin, I remember them being active and in action, and that was in the 90s. So I find that really interesting that, you know, it's still a thriving place and is starting to really bring people together around these ideas and to discuss them. And we have people from not just all over Ireland, but a couple of people from outside Ireland on the call as well, which is fantastic. So again, I'd love to facilitate some different questions. So that's interesting. Gertrude has asked on the 4 lenses slide, where is the political? So would you like to address that, Carol?
Okay, so I guess, yeah, that introduces a different perspective. So I suppose, is it in terms of the political will to do these things, or how? So I suppose this lens, this kind of tool to create a portrait of, it is to create a portrait of a city, really. It involves, you know, coalitions of local people, local groups coming together to identify, you know, what are we doing well, and you know, what assets do we have in our community that can actually help us to thrive locally, to support local ecology, to you know, to take care of people in, for instance, the supply chains of the products that we consume around the world, the people in the supply chains, and also our impact on the planet. In terms of the political side of things, I'm not sure whether it's a political with a small p or a capital P, but I suppose, you know, in cities that have embraced the donut, and Amsterdam is the most high-profile one that has embraced the donut. Then, you know, city authorities, so the public sector, would be a very important actor in facilitating this and in driving it through. So I don't know if that answers the question.
So maybe I can talk a little bit about that, because I'm connected to the Global Doughnut Economic Action Lab, and sat in a panel last week actually with Jen, who runs the Amsterdam Coalition Melbourne, who has just launched Regen Melbourne, which is an amazing model and very beautifully presented. And I participated in some of their workshops, which were astonishing. And also the Devon Doughnut, which actually is based from a bioregion and combines both rural and urban spaces, and they talk about having a box of donuts rather than a donut. So there's a couple of things. The conversation around a city snapshot is one thing, and I think if you live in a city, that's all well and good, but if you don't live in a city, I think there are different contexts for it. I think the city donut is very easy to relate to, and as you say, there are some very high profile pieces. I think as well is that when you take the donut, it's a 3D construct, right? It gives you this lens to shape and focus and move in and out of relevant things to the people active in the donut, and talking about it in that way and living the values of it, and whether you're in a co-op or not. And I think what I would see in this XY axis questioning of this slide that's here is that behind that, this is just one element of talking about the donut and bringing people towards the donut, that what you always have is you also always have this 3D model, and it really is about who shows up within that space, within that conversation, and how they bring small p political or big P political, as somebody has mentioned there. There's some great comments going on in the chat. So Gertrude and John Barimo have both asked the same question about political, and I think, oh no, sorry, it was Patrick. And I think that's a very interesting one. I think also, you know, what we're seeing in the Doughnut Economics Action Lab and across that spectrum where people are in action all across the globe is that it's grassroots as well as policy. So there's a point where they have to meet in the middle. And what we're seeing in action is people not waiting for politicians, getting into action already. And West Cork, Mose is actually on this call. West Cork is a great example of that. And they're already up in action. In Wexford, I've taken a different approach where I'm trying to talk to the County Council. Well, I have been talking to them and I've been getting really mixed reactions. So I think it's about your place. And the great thing about Doughnut Economics and Action Lab is it invites you to move at your pace, in your sense of place, and find the value within it for where you are in what context. So I sometimes refer to places where people live, work, play, and learn. And I think if we look at our communities and the potential for Doughnut Economics across those communities, whether it's of place or whether it's of learning, like UCC, for example, I think that gives us different context. And the Dublin Food Co-op is, if you've already got a co-op and up and running and it's lived and lived its values and it's had a really strong value system attached to it, you're probably already living within some of the principles. But what it allows you to do is allows you to articulate what you're doing and to showcase what you're doing so you can bring more people to that space. And I think that's really interesting. Carol, you mentioned the emergence of new models and cooperative platforms. So one of the things I've definitely seen, and it's interesting, you talk about community wealth building. So whenever I hear wealth building, it sends a slight alarm bell for me. So what I see is this potential as we move into community energy to build community assets that can be held in co-ops and that can revolutionize maybe how small rural communities afford things like a microgrid system through their community, afford like a biodigester to reduce waste, and how that we build a different kind of activation of both urban and rural spaces within co-ops through community assets and distributed ownership, and bringing a new kind of voice to democracy as well. So, sorry, that's just going back to the chat to have a look at what else is there. Oh, so there's a few other questions. So this is an interesting comment from John Barrymore. I personally think the donut can be of conscience or value-based for a circular economy. Yeah, that's definitely something we see. On Oit, Ella in Galway can also be involved in the development of mental health spaces. Somebody asked about health. Let me find where it is. So it was shared by Kevin Flanagan, Co-op in Care Sector, the great care co-op.ie. Just trying to read through the questions. Do you know of any co-ops in the provision of medical services? John Kennedy asked that question. Carol, do you want to respond to that in any way?
Mm-hmm. In Ireland, medical services, no. I know, there are examples of healthcare co-ops in other countries, including Canada. The Great Care co-op that you mentioned there from the chat is, as I understand it, a co-op set up to provide a cooperative organisation for migrant workers in the healthcare or in the elder care and social care sector in Ireland to organise as a workers' co-op. And I suppose that's particularly important as well in a sector where caring for people is a challenging job, and it often goes unrewarded, and it's a very important job caring for our older people, and I think that sense of ownership and control of the organisation is very empowering to people in that sector, and gives them the recognition and the sense of agency and control over their work, and is motivating for workers, which ultimately helps to provide a better service.
Brilliant.
And I think there is huge scope to develop the cooperative care sector in Ireland.
Yeah, there's great examples in Italy with the social cooperatives in Italy. It's very well established. Yeah, involving both, you know, service users, families, and doctors and specialists in the process of design of the services. Yeah.
So, Carol, I've learned to really talk about work, just to build on something you said. I've really learned to talk about work in 3 different ways: to talk about livelihood work, to talk about invisible work, and to talk about pro bono work. So I think that one of the things that I see with the Doughnut is we can make and hold the spaces in our society and in the way we live and in our communities. We can hold, the Doughnut allows us to make space and to name and really take care and consideration about all of those different types of work, whether it's caring for somebody within the community. And we've seen that demonstrated in COVID. And I think this allows us to shift our lens really at this time and really take ownership of that. I've pinged you a direct message on one of the questions. There was a great question there. So I just sent it directly to you, Carol, if you'd answer it in the chat. Just because I'm scrolling through the chat to try and get the questions. Oh yeah, here it is. How are we sure if a co-op is really a co-op? I know of a case where only the management forms the co-op, where the workers are exploited. Does this situation meet the legal definition of a co-op in Ireland?
Okay, so that's an interesting one. So I suppose co-ops, you know, I suppose just because something is called a co-op doesn't mean that it's going to live up to the values and principles of the co-op. So they're meant to do that. But you know, if the organization isn't well run and well governed, then there obviously is the risk that, you know, people may be exploited if they don't kind of live up to those values and principles of co-ops.
Okay, it's a really interesting answer. And then there's another question here. Can you tell me if there are any governance models that combine local action, integrated cooperatives, food cooperatives with global impact, like platform co-ops? Last.
Okay, so combining food co-ops. Sorry.
Open Food Network jumps to mind. The platform co-op that enables local food hubs to run their online marketplaces. I think that's the kind of thing. I'll put a link in the chat there.
That'd be great. There was also some questions about the Cleveland model. Carol, I don't know if you've some easy access links, because everybody's coming at this from different directions. You mentioned also the Preston model. I'm interested to understand more about that.
Yes. So there's a very good report by Sean McCabe of TASC. I think it was a report that was done for the National Economic and Social Council about community wealth building. And I think there is a fairly comprehensive account of the Preston model in that.
Great.
That report. The Cleveland example, so the evergreen cooperatives, so that there are 3 different cooperatives organised under that evergreen brand, so to speak. Yeah, there are some interesting studies there.
Great. There is also a question from somebody doing a master's in NCAD if they could reach out to you directly for a follow-up of information around sustainable grocery shop topic, very early stage.
Yeah.
And I think obviously the Dublin Food Co-op is really well placed there. So I would hope, Chu, that you'd reach out. I mentioned I'm actually going to be working with the MA in Service Design up in NCAD at the beginning of June. So you'll be seeing me there anyway. Great. So any other questions while we have Carol still here?
My email address is on the first slide there. So if anybody would like to reach out to me, you're more than welcome.
Wonderful. So if there's any other questions, anybody got anything else?
Yeah, we can share I can send around. Would it be possible to share the slides?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I can send them on to people. Yeah.
That's great. And I've suggested that if there's a space with Dublin Food Co-op to write up a blog post, we could include the slides and the chat in that too, so people can find them subsequently as well. That would be super if that could be facilitated. Yeah, so sure. Great stuff. I'm just conscious of time, so we're going to finish on time. We have a minute. So Carol, is there anything that you'd like to add in wrapping up?
No, I think I hope that the session has been useful today, and I'd like to thank Dublin Food Co-op again for hosting this, and it's really important. I suppose one of the responsibilities of co-ops is to spread the co-op message and to help to I suppose sow the seeds of new co-op formation. And I think this webinar series is a really important way of doing that, of spreading the message. So I'd just like to thank Dublin Food Co-op and yourself, Róisín, and the Irish Doughnut Economics Network for participating today as well.
Thanks, Carol. And I'd like to iterate that. I think that this series that Dublin Food Co-op are running is excellent. And I think they're really starting to engage people around co-ops. And I think that's brilliant, because I think co-ops have a really significant role to play in how we move from extractive economic models into different economic models and be more inclusive in our society, creating a society that shapes a future worth living into for all of us. So Míle buchas for everybody for coming on today. It's been great participation. Well done, Dublin Food Co-op, and thank you for inviting us to that. Anybody wants to join the Irish Doughnut Economics Couple later, it'd be great to see you. Invitations and the follow-up with Zoom information will be going out around 5 o'clock. So please sign up before then, register before then. And thanks a million. Carol, thanks. That was fascinating. Looking forward to going back through the slides.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining. And do keep an eye on the Dublin Food Co-op website at dublinfood.coop and have a look at our community development program or series of events, upcoming events. Thank you everyone, and
thanks, Kevin.
Have a nice afternoon.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.